Okay, let's get into this. It's kind of staggering when you think about it, but Chernobyl, this name synonymous with nuclear disaster, it all started with what was supposed to be, a fairly standard electrical test.
Exactly. A routine procedure, really. But it
Right.
just spiraled.
Completely. And it's that spiral, that combination of factors, starting with this test, that led to, well, the worst nuclear accident we've ever seen.
It really does. It shows how, decisions that seem small within these really complex systems can just have these huge, devastating outcomes.
Right. So for this deep dive, we've gone through all the information you sent over about Chernobyl. And our mission really is to pull out the absolute core of what happened, the sequence of events, the immediate response or lack thereof sometimes, and of course the long shadow it cast, the impact on people, the environment.
Yeah, aiming for a clear picture. Not just the facts, but the real significance of it all.
Exactly. We want to give you a clear, insightful, maybe even unforgettable grasp of this really pivotal moment in history.
And it's not just looking back, is it? Understanding Chernobyl. It's about the lessons, the challenges that are still there, and how it continues to shape how we think about nuclear power, about managing these high-risk technologies today.
Definitely. Okay, so let's set the scene. It's April 26th, 1986. We're at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant in Ukraine, which was part of the Soviet Union back then.
Right.
Reactor number 4 is scheduled for a power down, and there's this safety test planned. What exactly were they trying to achieve with this test?
So the basic idea, the goal, was to see if the turbine, as it was spinning down, its rotational energy, could it generate enough electricity to power the emergency core cooling system.
Ah, okay. During a total power outage.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Because you got these backup diesel generators, right? But they take maybe a minute or so to kick in fully.
A critical minute.
A very critical minute.
Yeah.
So the test was designed to see if the turbine's momentum could bridge that gap, keep the cooling pumps running until the diesels took over.
And had they tried this before?
They had, yeah. Previous attempts hadn't actually been successful in proving it would work as hoped. So it's still kind of an open question.
Okay, so they're trying again. Now, it sounds like this wasn't viewed as a major nuclear safety procedure, more like tweaking the electrics.
That's a really crucial piece of the puzzle.
Yep.
It was classified as purely electrical.
Even though it directly involved the reactor.
Yes. And because of that label, electrical, it bypassed the need for approval from the main design authority or the nuclear safety regulator.
Wow. So less oversight.
Significantly less. And that lack of sort of high-level safety scrutiny turned out to be a huge factor. Thinking a test impacting core safety was just electrical. And that really points to some maybe organizational blind spots.
And this is where it gets, for me anyway, particularly unnerving. Part of the test involved disabling the emergency core cooling system. The very system they were testing the power supply for. The safety net was switched off for the test. It just seems backwards.
It does sound counterintuitive, doesn't it? But the thinking was they had to simulate a total loss of power scenario to properly test the turbine bridge.
I see the logic, but
wow. But yeah, disabling a critical safety system like that, even temporarily for a test, it automatically ramps up the risk, especially when you factor in the specific design quirks of that reactor, the RBMK.
Right, which brings us to how things started to go wrong. The test involved reducing the reactor power first, correct? And that didn't quite go to plan.
No, it didn't. The plan was to bring the thermal power down to somewhere between 700 and 1,000 megawatts.
Yeah.
They got it down to about 720, but then the power just plummeted, unexpectedly low.
Hello.
Almost to a complete shutdown level. We're talking maybe 30 megawatts,
Yeah.
possibly even less for a bit.
What caused that sudden drop?
It was mainly something called xenon-135 poisoning.
Yes.
You can think of xenon-135 as like a sponge that soaks up the neutrons you need for the chain reaction. At normal high power, it gets burned off as quickly as it's created. But when you lower the power significantly, it builds up fast, and it really dampens or poisons the reaction, stops it.
So the reactor kind of choked itself, in a way.
You could put it like that, yeah. And then, trying to counteract this xenon effect, trying to get the power back up to the level they needed for the test, well, the operators started making decisions that, unfortunately, made the reactor even more unstable.
What did they do?
They started pulling out the control rods, a lot of them.
Okay, quick refresher. Control rods absorb neutrons to slow the reaction down. Right, so pulling them out increases power.
Exactly. They absorb neutrons so they control the rate of fission. Pulling them out lets more neutrons cause more fissions, increasing power. To fight that xenon poisoning, they pulled out so many rods that they went below the minimum safe operating limit.
There's a minimum number that have to stay in.
Yes, the operational reactivity margin, basically how much brake you have left to control the reactor quickly. It fell below the required minimum, which was supposed to be equivalent to 15 fully inserted rods.
Did they know they'd gone below that limit?
That's another critical issue. The RBMK design at the time didn't have adequate instruments to calculate that margin accurately in real time under those conditions. So the operators were essentially flying blind regarding just how unstable the reactor had become.
That sounds incredibly dangerous, just operating it like that. But you mentioned the reactor design itself, the RBMK, that played a part too.
A massive part. Especially at low power levels, the RBMK had what's called a positive void coefficient.
Okay, what does that mean in simple terms?
It means if steam bubbles voids form in the cooling water, the nuclear reaction actually speeds up.
Hang on, normally more steam would mean less cooling, slowing things down, wouldn't it?
In many Western reactor designs, yes. But in the RBMK, the water also acts as a neutron absorber. Steam absorbs far fewer neutrons than liquid water. So lose the water, replace it with steam voids, and the chain reaction intensifies.
So less water means more power?
At low power levels, yes. It creates this incredibly dangerous positive feedback loop. As the test proceeded and they reduced water flow, more steam formed. That increased the power, which boiled more water, creating more steam.
Which increased the power even more, a runaway effect.
Exactly. It wasn't just some technical details, like a built-in accelerator pedal that got pressed harder the hotter things got, especially at low power. Any instability could just get amplified dramatically.
So the reactor was basically a powder keg waiting for a spark, and then they hit the shutdown button, the scram. AZ5, was it?
Yes, AZ5, the emergency shutdown.
But even that went wrong, catastrophically wrong.
It did. When they pressed that button, the control rods started inserting from the top down into the core. And this is just a terrible flaw. The RBMK control rods had graphite tips.
Graphite? Like in pencils?
Well, reactor-grade graphite. It's a moderator. It slows down neutrons, which actually increases fission. The main part of the rod was neutron-absorbing material, but the tip was graphite.
So what happened when they went in?
As the rods inserted, those graphite tips went in first. They displaced the water, which was absorbing some neutrons in the bottom part of the core. So for the first few moments of the shutdown, in the lower core region, reactivity actually increased sharply. A power spike, just when you desperately need things to shut down.
The shutdown attempt made the situation worse.
In that critical initial phase, yes. It was a disastrous design feature in the emergency system itself.
That's almost unbelievable, and you're saying this wasn't a complete unknown, this graphite tip issue.
That's the really tragic part. A very similar effect, a power spike during rod insertion, had actually been seen a few years earlier, 1983, at another RBMK plant, Ignalina.
And nothing was done.
No procedural changes, no design modifications were mandated across the fleet. The thinking seemed to be that the very specific, unstable conditions needed for this positive scram effect were so unlikely they wouldn't happen in normal operation.
But they did happen at Chernobyl.
Almost exactly. It wasn't just an oversight. It really shows how engineering details that might seem minor can have these immense consequences.
Yeah.
And knowing about Ignalina, it does make you question the safety culture, doesn't it? Why wasn't that addressed more urgently?
Absolutely. So, okay, the scram is initiated. This power spike happens in the lower core. What happens next? Seconds later.
In seconds, yeah. This huge power surge. The core starts to overheat incredibly rapidly. Fuel rods rupture.
Came apart.
Yes. And fragments likely block the channels the control rods were meant to travel down, so they got stuck, maybe only there to the way in. The shutdown failed.
So the reaction is just running wild.
Completely uncontrolled. Within maybe 3 seconds of hitting AZ5, the power output rocketed up to, estimates say, at least 530 thermal megawatts, possibly much, much higher, very locally. And then came the explosions.
Plural.
2 distinct blasts, yes. The first one, maybe a second or two after the power surge, was probably a steam explosion. Just superheated cooling water flashing instantly into a massive volume of steam.
Right, a powerful steam blast. And the second?
A second explosion a few seconds later was much, much bigger, far more destructive.
Yeah.
Blew the reactor lid off, destroyed the building. Its exact cause is still debated a bit by scientists.
What are the main theories?
Well, one early idea was a hydrogen explosion. Hydrogen could have been produced from reactions between steam and the zirconium fuel cladding, or maybe steam and the superhot graphite moderator.
Uh-huh.
But another theory, which has gained quite a bit of traction, especially based on detecting specific isotopes like xenon-135 far away, suggests it was actually a very rapid nuclear power transient.
Like a mini nuclear explosion.
Not a full atomic bomb-style detonation, no. More like a very localized, extremely fast, uncontrolled burst of nuclear fission in a small part of the melting core, sometimes called a fizzle. It would still release a massive amount of energy very quickly.
How much energy are we talking about?
The estimates for that second blast are often compared to something like maybe 10 tons of TNT equivalent.
10 tons of TNT inside a reactor building. The devastation must have been immediate and absolute.
Just catastrophic. Massive destruction to the reactor building itself. And fires broke out instantly. Not just in Reactor 4, but debris landed on the roof of Reactor 3 next door, which was still running, setting it ablaze too.
Reactor 3 was still operating.
Yes. And the first people on the scene were the firefighters. They arrived incredibly quickly.
But they wouldn't have known.
They had almost no idea what they were walking into. They knew there was a fire, a big one. Many were reportedly told it was an electrical fire on the roof.
Just an electrical fire.
That was the initial report given to some. Though some accounts from the firefighters themselves suggest they suspected something was very wrong, beyond just fire. But critically, they didn't have the information about the massive radiation hazard or the right protective gear for it.
So they went in blind, essentially.
They went in with incredible bravery, facing the flames, but utterly exposed to lethal radiation levels. It's just...
Yeah.
Yeah. The design flaws set the stage, but the immediate aftermath, it was about human courage meeting this invisible killer.
Heartbreaking. And inside the plant, for the reactor crew who survived the blasts.
Equally dire, if not worse. Radiation levels in the control room and around the wreckage were astronomically high. In some spots, you could receive a fatal dose in minutes.
Could they even measure it accurately?
Mostly no. Many of the dosimeters they had were destroyed, or they simply went off scale, unable to read such high levels. This lack of data was critical, because the reactor crew chief, Dyatlov's deputy Akimov, initially didn't believe the reactor core itself had been destroyed, even with graphite blocks and fuel scattered outside.
He thought it was intact.
For a while, yes. Based on the limited incorrect readings they had. He and his crew stayed in the damaged building for hours, trying desperately to pump cooling water into a reactor core that essentially wasn't there anymore.
Without proper protection.
Without adequate protection, yes. Tragically, most of that shift crew, including Akimov, died from acute radiation sickness in the weeks that followed.
While they were inside trying to understand and react what was happening outside to fight the fire and contain the release, I remember hearing about helicopters.
Yes, a massive effort kicked off using helicopters. They flew thousands of sorties over the burning reactor pit.
Dropping what?
Over 5,000 metric tons of material. Sand, clay, lead, boron. Trying to smother the graphite fire and absorb radiation.
Did it work?
It was incredibly dangerous for the pilots, flying through intense radiation plumes. And we now know a lot of that material actually missed the target, missed the reactor core itself. The fire inside the wreckage burned for many days, continuing to spew radioactive isotopes high into the atmosphere.
Just pumping it out. Which leads to the next awful necessity. Evacuation. Pripyat, the plant city.
Right, the nearby city built for the plant workers and their families.
Okay.
The evacuation didn't start immediately.
How long did it take?
It began about 36 hours after the explosions, which, in hindsight, seems far too long.
And what were people told?
They were told it was temporary, just for about 3 days. Pack only essentials, documents.
So people left assuming they'd be back soon.
Exactly. They left pets, photographs, most belongings behind. Around 53,000 people were bussed out of Pripyat and the immediate vicinity initially.
And then the zone expanded.
Yes. Over the next days and weeks, as the scale of the contamination became clearer, the exclusion zone was widened, eventually out to 30 kilometers around the plant. And that zone, with some adjustments, is largely still in place today. Protecting people became the absolute priority once the extent of the release started to become undeniable.
But it wasn't immediately undeniable to the authorities, or at least they didn't admit it immediately. The Soviet response?
No, initially there was a period of silence, then denial, then significant downplay.
How did the world find out?
It was actually radiation detectors at a nuclear power plant in Sweden, Forsmark, over 1,000 kilometers away. They picked up unusual radioactive particles on workers' shoes.
From Chernobyl?
Yes. That set off alarms internationally. Sweden demanded answers from Moscow. Even then, the first Soviet acknowledgments were very vague, talking about just an accident.
Not the scale of it.
Not at all. It was only under mounting international pressure, as radiation alarms went off across Scandinavia and Europe, that they finally started to admit the severity. The first proper announcement on Soviet TV was just a brief 20-second statement 2 whole days after the explosion.
That delay must have been critical for timely health advice, surely.
Absolutely. That initial secrecy had serious consequences. Meanwhile, back at the site, they were facing the enormous task of containing the destroyed reactor itself, building the sarcophagus, yes, the object shelter, or sarcophagus, a monumental construction job under the worst possible conditions, extremely high radiation.
How did they even do it?
Remotely operated machinery where possible, specialized cranes with heavily lead-shielded cabins for the operators. Workers could only be on site for very short periods. At the same time, scientific teams were going back into the wreckage, trying to locate the melted fuel. Incredible bravery, or perhaps desperation.
And alongside that, the cleanup, the liquidators. We hear that term a lot.
Hundreds of thousands of people. Many were military reservists, called up. Others were miners, engineers, drivers, medics. Their job was the decontamination, cleaning roofs, burying contaminated soil, hosing down buildings.
Under what conditions?
Often with, well, frankly, inadequate protective gear, and often with a poor understanding of the invisible risks they faced. For the hottest spots, like debris on the roofs of the other reactor building, workers, sometimes called bio-robots, could literally only work for seconds. Maybe 40 seconds, 90 seconds, before they'd absorbed their maximum permitted dose and had to be rotated out.
Just seconds.
Yes. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 600,000 and 800,000 people were involved in these liquidation efforts over several years. Many received significant radiation doses.
Let's shift then to the longer-term consequences.
Yeah.
Health, environment. This is where the impact stretches decades into the future.
It really does. Immediately, of course, there are the tragic direct deaths, 2 workers killed in the explosions themselves. And then 28 more, mostly plant staff and firefighters, died from acute radiation syndrome, ARS, within the first 3 months. Horrific illness.
And beyond those initial victims.
Over the next 10 years or so, maybe another dozen or so of the initially hospitalized ARS survivors died, though not all directly from radiation effects. But it's important to stress, Chernobyl is still the only accident in the history of commercial nuclear power to cause radiation-linked fatalities on this scale.
Okay. But then there's the cancer risk, particularly thyroid cancer in children.
Yes, that's one of the clearest, most undeniable long-term health impacts. A very significant increase in childhood thyroid cancer cases across Belarus, Ukraine, and parts of Russia.
How many cases?
By 2005, the UN reported over 6,000 cases in people who were children or adolescents at the time of the accident.
And why thyroid cancer specifically?
It's linked primarily to inhaling or ingesting radioactive iodine, specifically iodine-131. It's released in large amounts in fission, has a relatively short half-life of about 8 days, but the body concentrates iodine in the thyroid gland. Children's thyroids are particularly active and susceptible.
Is it treatable?
Thankfully, most forms of thyroid cancer are highly treatable if caught reasonably early. The recovery rates have been generally very high, over 90%, but there have been tragically some fatalities among those cases over the years.
What about other cancers? Leukemia, solid tumors in the liquidators or the general population?
That's been studied extensively, and it's more complex. The broad scientific consensus, organizations like the UN Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, UNSEER, is that there hasn't been a statistically significant increase observed in rates of most other cancers, including leukemia, that can be definitively attributed to Chernobyl radiation among the liquidators or the wider affected populations.
But there are predictions of future deaths.
Yes, various groups have made projections of potential future excess cancer deaths over many decades based on different models of low-dose radiation risk. These estimates vary quite widely, from a few thousand up to tens or even hundreds of thousands, depending on the methodology used. But observed increases beyond thyroid cancer have been very hard to statistically prove against the background cancer rates.
But the health impact wasn't just cancer, was it? The psychological toll.
Oh, immense. Absolutely huge. Widespread reports of anxiety, depression, PTSD, psychosomatic illnesses, physical symptoms caused by psychological stress.
Driven by fear.
Largely, yes. Fear of radiation, fear of future illness, the trauma of being evacuated, losing homes, communities, livelihoods. This persistent anxiety, sometimes called radiophobia, has been a major public health burden.
And it had other tragic consequences, too.
Yes. Sadly. In the months after Chernobyl, there was a noticeable increase in induced abortions across parts of Europe, even in areas with very low contamination. Doctors and parents, driven by fear and sometimes misinformation about the potential effects on fetuses, made these incredibly difficult decisions.
Based on unfounded fears.
Largely, yes. Subsequent large-scale studies haven't found any demonstrable increase in birth defects or congenital abnormalities linked to Chernobyl radiation exposure in the general population.
Okay, let's turn to the environment. The exclusion zone. We hear these stories about wildlife thriving. Is that accurate?
It's a really interesting kind of paradoxical situation. Immediately after the accident, the environmental damage near the plant was severe. The red forest is the famous example. Acres of pine trees turned reddish-brown and died from the intense radiation dose.
Right.
But over the longer term, because humans largely left the exclusion zone, nature has, in many ways, bounced back. Despite the lingering radioactivity in the soil, cesium-137, strontium-90, plutonium isotopes, the lack of human pressure like farming, logging, hunting,
has allowed wildlife to return.
Return and, in many cases, flourish. There are thriving populations of wolves, elk, wild boar, deer, lynx, bison were reintroduced, many bird species. It's become a unique, albeit contaminated, nature reserve.
But the contamination is still there.
Oh, absolutely. It's in the soil, the plants, the animals themselves. Agricultural land and forests outside the main zone were also significantly contaminated.
Leading to restrictions.
Yes, long-term restrictions on farming, forestry, gathering mushrooms and berries in certain areas. You might remember, even in places like North Wales in the UK or parts of Norway, there were restrictions on sheep farming for many, many years because the cesium concentrated in upland soils and got into the grazing sheep.
Have those been lifted now?
Mostly, yes, through monitoring, land management, and natural decay processes over decades. But it shows how far-reaching the contamination was.
And how persistent was the contamination spread evenly?
Not at all. It depended heavily on wind and rain patterns in the days after the accident. Some areas got heavy fallout, others relatively little. Mountainous areas often got more because rain washed the radioactive particles out of the atmosphere.
What about water contamination? Rivers, groundwater?
Groundwater was less of a major issue initially, as many key radionuclides bind tightly to soil. Surface waters, rivers, and lakes did get contaminated, leading to accumulation in fish. For years, fish in some lakes within the zone had radioactivity levels way above safe limits for consumption.
And you mentioned the red forest died. Has it recovered?
Yes, the area has largely been recolonized by different, more radiation-resistant deciduous trees and other vegetation.
Yeah.
Nature finds a way, it seems.
There was even mention of fungi eating radiation?
Sort of, yeah. Radiotrophic fungi. These dark pigmented fungi have been found growing inside the damaged reactor building itself, on the walls. They seem to use the melanin pigment to somehow harness the energy from the ionizing radiation, a bit like plants use chlorophyll for photosynthesis. It's fascinating.
Nature is incredible. What about ongoing contamination issues like the wild boars in Germany?
Ah, yes, the radioactive boars. That's a persistent issue in some regions, particularly Bavaria. Their levels of cesium-137 remain surprisingly high. It's partly Chernobyl fallout, which they ingest through things like underground truffles that concentrate cesium, but research suggests it might also be partly due to residual cesium from atmospheric nuclear weapons testing back in the 50s and 60s. So a double dose, maybe?
Right. Let's look at the site itself today. The other reactors are shut down now.
Yes, all of them. Reactor 2 was shut down after a fire in 1991, Reactor 1 in 1996, and the last one, Reactor 3, the one right next door to the exploded one, was finally shut down in December 2000.
And the original sarcophagus over Reactor 4, that wasn't permanent.
No, never intended to be. It was built incredibly fast under horrific conditions. It did its job containing the worst of the dust initially, but it had structural weaknesses, gaps, and was deteriorating. There was a real risk of collapse.
Which led to the new safe confinement.
Exactly, that gigantic arch structure, a huge international project, incredibly complex engineering. They built it nearby and then slid it over the top of the old sarcophagus in Reactor 4.
When was that finished?
It was moved into place in late 2016 and fully commissioned later. It's designed to last at least 100 years, keep the elements out, contain any remaining radioactive dust, and allow for the eventual dismantling of the reactor building and the old sarcophagus underneath it.
A truly massive undertaking. What about all the nuclear fuel? Both the spent fuel from the other reactors and the melted stuff inside number 4.
For the spent fuel from reactors 1, 2, and 3, there are now modern storage facilities on site. An older wet storage facility, ISF-1, and a large new dry storage facility, ISF-2, designed for very long-term storage.
And inside the wreckage, the melted core,
That's the fuel-containing materials, or FCMs, sometimes called corium. It's this lava-like mixture of melted fuel, cladding, control rods, concrete, steel, incredibly radioactive stuff, solidified in the lower levels of the reactor building.
Is it stable?
Mostly, yes. But it's slowly degrading over time, becoming more brittle, creating dust. And there's been recent concern and ongoing monitoring about potential increases in neutron activity in some inaccessible sub-reactor rooms where some FCMs are located.
Neutron activity, does that mean?
It suggests the possibility of localized, self-sustaining fission reactions starting up again, perhaps as rainwater seeps in and acts as a moderator. It's not expected to be explosive, but it needs very careful monitoring and potentially intervention in the future to ensure long-term safety.
So still risks within the structure itself. And the wider exclusion zone, you mentioned wildlife, but also people who returned.
Yes, the Samozli, or self-settlers, mostly elderly people, mostly women, who defied the ban and returned to live in their old villages within the zone, despite the contamination.
Why?
A deep connection to their homes, their land. They cultivate gardens, live very traditional lives. The numbers are dwindling now, of course. It's a poignant aspect of the Chernobyl story.
And tourism. People actually visit the zone.
Yes. In the years before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Chernobyl tourism became quite a significant, if controversial, industry. Guided tours to Pripyat, around the power plant.
Is it safe?
If you follow the strict rules, stay on designated paths, don't touch anything, the external dose received on a short tour is very low, comparable to a long-haul flight. But there are risks, like inhaling dust and the ethical considerations of disaster tourism. And wildfires are a big worry. They can remobilize radioactive particles from the soil and vegetation into the air.
Okay, finally, let's zoom out. The wider impact, socially, politically. Chernobyl wasn't just a technological disaster.
Not at all. The economic cost alone was staggering.
Yeah.
Billions and billions of rubles for the Soviet Union, then immense ongoing costs for Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, for cleanup, healthcare, compensation, lost agricultural land. Some argue the sheer cost significantly strained the Soviet economy in its final years.
And politically, you mentioned the initial secrecy.
Yes. Chernobyl happened just as Mikhail Gorbachev was introducing his policy of glasnost openness. The handling of Chernobyl, the initial cover-up followed by the slow release of information, severely damaged public trust in the Soviet government, both domestically and internationally. It arguably fueled demands for more transparency and contributed to the forces that eventually led to the Soviet Union's collapse.
And how did it impact nuclear power globally?
Hugely. It forced a major reevaluation of safety culture and reactor design worldwide, especially for Soviet-designed reactors. Safety standards were tightened everywhere.
Did it stop new reactors being built?
It definitely caused a slowdown, a chill, in many countries. Public opposition surged. Some countries, like Italy, held referendums and decided to phase out nuclear power entirely. Germany accelerated its phase-out plans. Elsewhere, it led to delays and increased cost for new projects due to enhanced safety requirements.
So better safety, but also more public resistance.
Exactly. It also led to important international agreements conventions on early notification of nuclear accidents and on providing assistance, managed by the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA.
Yeah.
Lessons were learned about international cooperation.
And culturally, Chernobyl looms large, doesn't it?
Immensely. It's inspired countless books, films, documentaries, like the recent acclaimed HBO series Artwork, even video games. It's become a powerful symbol of technological hubris, environmental disaster, human tragedy, and also resilience. A touchstone event for the modern world.
Right. So if we try and boil this incredibly complex event down, our deep dive shows this confluence, doesn't it? A fundamentally flawed reactor design, especially at low power, combined with a poorly planned, poorly executed test where safety procedures were bypassed or overridden.
Driven by production pressures, perhaps.
Leading to an uncontrolled reaction, catastrophic explosions, and then these devastating immediate deaths, and the long, long tail of consequences. Health, environment, society.
Decades later, we're still dealing with it. And going back to that starting point, this huge disaster, kicking off from a seemingly minor electrical systems test, it just hammers home how vital safety culture is, how interconnected things are in complex technology. You can't just look at systems in isolation.
Absolutely. So for you listening, we hope walking through this, again, pulling out these threads, has given you a clearer, maybe more textured understanding of Chernobyl and why it still matters so much.
Yeah, and maybe it leaves you with a question to mull over. Thinking about Chernobyl, what are the really key lessons we absolutely must apply when we're managing risk in all the other complex, potentially hazardous technologies we rely on today, from AI to biotech to, well, future energy systems.
Mm-hmm.
How does an event like this shape how we think about our responsibilities, our long-term responsibilities that come with wielding such powerful technologies?
Really important questions. Definitely food for thought. And of course, if anything we've discussed has sparked your interest, do dive into the sources, explore further. There's so much more detail out there. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.